Hi, welcome back to another video. If you're new around here, I'm Bex. I'm mum to Finley, he's nearly 2 years old, and I make videos about Hugo, gentle parenting and lifestyle. I wanted to have enough emotional distance to be able to make the video without becoming emotional on camera. So that's why it's taken about 1.5 years to make this video. I thought I'd split this video into 3 parts. I thought I would go into the factors that affected our feeding journey, how it made me feel, and then what advice I would give to another mum in this position. Grab your cup of tea, get yourself comfy, and I'll get into it. So when I was pregnant, I decided I wanted to combi feed. It's something that I wanted to do from the beginning, and I had thought that I would maybe start to introduce a bottle around the safe period after about 12 weeks of feeding. And then I would predominantly breastfeed and then combination feed sort of in the evenings. That way it would give Dan space and time to sort of bond with our baby, and it would also give me some sort of let up and break in the evening from feeding. So that was sort of what the plan was. In the later stages of my pregnancy, I hadn't planned to buy any bottles or anything at that point, because I just thought I would wait until the baby arrived and then work out from there which bottle to use and when to introduce. And so I really had prepared to breastfeed from the beginning. I had bought an electric pump, thankfully. It was a Medela Swing that I had managed to find unused secondhand. Finley arrived early, and so I was due to have my breastfeeding antenatal class the week after Finley arrived. So I went into breastfeeding completely unprepared. I didn't have the first clue about how to start, didn't know anything about the positions. I just tried to do what came naturally to me. And I do have to say, although I found it painful from the beginning, which I'll get into in a minute, I instantly felt that bond that breastfeeding would give you. It felt like it was the right decision, and it wasn't something that after a couple of days of breastfeeding that I wanted to sort of switch onto bottle feeding. That, you know, it wasn't really part of the plan at all. So one of the factors that affected my success with breastfeeding was tongue tie. I knew instantly when Finley was born and they asked me to sort of get him latched on, I knew straight away that he had tongue tie. I'm grateful for the fact that I knew this because I knew the signs to look out for. I had watched a video which I will leave linked below from STRUM'S on her experience with tongue tie and breastfeeding, and one of the things that sort of stood out to me was Finley would constantly sort of slide off the boob, so I knew straight away that the latch wasn't very good, and when I looked he wasn't able to sort of fit the nipple fully into his mouth, and his latch wasn't very good, despite several midwives telling me that the latch was good. I just knew straight away something didn't feel right, and that a lot of the symptoms that I could see in front of me with Finley trying to latch and feed, they were classic signs of tongue tie. So about 10-11 days after Finley was born, the midwife that was assigned to us decided that Finley had lost too much of his birth weight, and she decided he needed to go on a feeding plan that would include formula. This was something I really didn't want to happen. I obviously wanted to combination feed, but I hadn't planned to combination feed so soon. I wanted to get breastfeeding properly established before introducing a bottle. And if truth be known, I had started to enjoy the bond and closeness and just the feeling of being able to provide for my baby, that I knew I wanted to introduce a bottle at some point, but I wasn't in any hurry to, and I didn't want to do it at that point. I felt very much under pressure too, because obviously at that point your midwife telling you that your baby has lost too much of his birth weight, and you know, you don't want there to be a situation where your baby's admitted to hospital because of it. I sort of felt a bit scared into doing the whole process of introducing a bottle. Before I gave in, I wanted to try some new breastfeeding positions. I managed to get an NHS breastfeeding consultant to come round to look at my latch. She completely understood and agreed that the latch wasn't great, although she hadn't sort of identified tongue tie as the reason for the poor latch at this point. She was aware that Finley was on the list to be looked at for it. I tried nipple shields, which they just kept falling off. I couldn't find any that sort of fitted properly. I then ended up having to try and sort of snip the end off one of the nipple shields, which then it became pointless wearing them. I had really sore, bleeding, cracked nipples by this point, and just things weren't going very well. So after sort of trying alternatives, I knew that Finley obviously needed to put on the weight that he had lost, and so the midwife drew up a feeding schedule that included breastfeeding and expressing, and it was very grueling and very intensive, and we did that for I think it was a fortnight to 3 weeks. He did put the weight on that was needed, but I was upset at having to bottle feed him, and Dan gave him his first bottle feeds. I just felt in some way like I was betraying Finley. I know I wasn't, looking back. I think a lot of it is to do with sort of postpartum hormones making you feel more dramatic about the situation than it actually is. But looking back, I can just remember feeling incredibly emotional. Initially, I was able to pump quite a lot of milk. Our supply seemed good initially, and it was a strategy that sort of worked for us. Finley did see a specialist about his tongue tie. It had taken about 3.5 weeks and about 5 different people looking at Finley's tongue before a specialist saw him and agreed, yes, he did have tongue tie, and not only did he have it, it was a 100% tie. So should really have been picked up straight away. He had the procedure done, and although initially there was some sort of relief for me when feeding him, it didn't seem as painful, that his latch still wasn't great, and he had got so used to having a bottle by this point that he didn't really want to just fully breastfeed from me, and it wasn't really working out for us. I didn't want to lose the nutritional benefits for Finley that were associated with breastfeeding. I just decided that if he didn't want to breastfeed from me, I could still provide him with the breast milk, just expressing it and bottle feeding him it. And so we still combination fed. It was just different to how I had imagined it would be. I would say just as we were getting into a rhythm with pumping, at around sort of the 2 to 3 month mark, things took a bit of a nosedive, and it was related to my supply. I do think that Finley's poor latch obviously affected supply, and naturally what you would do is just try and up the amount of breastfeeding sessions that you're doing to try and increase the supply, because it's very much like a supply and demand issue. I tried more skin to skin during this time to try and kickstart my body into creating more oxytocin to increase my supply, but it didn't seem to be happening, and I didn't understand why. Looking back, I now completely understand why. Because my body couldn't produce enough milk because of my thyroid condition. The upshot of it is I had postpartum thyroiditis, and it hadn't been diagnosed at that point. Your thyroid manages all your bodily functions, and it's the central management system for your body. Looking back, it's no surprise really that I wasn't able to produce enough milk. But at that point, I didn't know I had it. I hadn't been diagnosed with it. All I knew at this point was that a lot of products that claim to increase your supply contain fenugreek, which if you have a thyroid problem, you can't have, because it messes with the absorption of your thyroid medication. So I knew I couldn't have any of the lactation cookies or lactation tea blends that you can buy to sort of increase your supply, because I knew they would mess with my medication. So I tried a few other alternatives to increase my supply. I did skin to skin, I tried power pumping, which I will leave some information linked below on if that's something you're interested in, and I made my own lactation cookies and lactation smoothies using pins that I had found on Pinterest that didn't contain fenugreek. And I sort of soldiered on. I even got to the point where I wondered if my breast pump wasn't effective enough. I had used the Medela Swing, which I had always found to be great, but I had even got to the point where I had started wondering if that was what the problem was. I managed to borrow a hospital grade pump from the community midwives, and just no matter what I seemed to be doing, my supply just wasn't increasing. It was just getting lower and lower, until eventually, after about 4 months of expressing milk, my supply finally dried up. So I didn't really have that moment that a lot of breastfeeding mums have when they decide to stop, where they have like a last feed, then they know it's going to be their last feed. I didn't really have that, and I sort of felt a bit robbed of that moment, because I wanted to sort of take that moment in of it being our last feed together. I didn't have it because it just came about one day where I was trying to express milk and I just couldn't get more than a few drops out when I was expressing. So that sort of neatly leads me on to how all of this made me feel. I felt an incredible sense of sadness, really is the best way I can describe it. I had always known I had wanted to combination feed, so it wasn't so much that the bottle feeding was affecting things particularly. I think it's just that the bottle feeding only served to highlight how ineffective I was at breastfeeding, and it just made me feel inadequate. I had a lot of mum guilt around it, just because when I was pregnant I had researched about the nutritional benefits of breastfeeding and of breast milk, particularly if you have a thyroid problem, because your immune system is set up by breast milk. And there's research to show that you can have a positive impact on the possibility of inheriting an autoimmune condition if you breastfeed. So there was an awful lot of guilt attached to the fact that I was no longer able to give Finley the breast milk that I wanted to give him. Mixed up with that was the fact that I knew that the formula that he was drinking, with it being cow's milk, I had highlighted that he had a dairy intolerance. So the very fact that I couldn't give him my breast milk made me feel worse, because I knew that was having an impact on his body. And I also just missed the bond and the closeness that's associated with breastfeeding. Being honest as well, I sort of felt ashamed and guilty when I would be in public bottle feeding Finley, because whether imagined or real, I just felt there was a sense of judgment from other mums who were looking at me when I was bottle feeding him. It's most likely that it was imagined. Nobody openly said anything to me about bottle feeding him. I just felt that people were looking at me, but again, it's most likely just the heightened emotions around it that I had at the time. So finally, I want to just talk about what I wish I had known and what I advise you to do if you're going through this yourself. And that is just firstly to be kinder to yourself. I didn't give myself the credit that I had just carried a baby successfully for 9 months and brought him into the world safely, and that I was also doing the very best that I could for him. I'd managed to rectify the problem with his tongue tie. I had done everything that I would have hoped a good mum would do, but I didn't give myself the credit and the kindness that I should have done. I think if I was able to do this over again, I probably would have looked elsewhere for specialist help. I think I probably would have gone more down the route of the LECHE, which I will leave linked below. They're obviously very pro breastfeeding, and are viewed by some as quite sort of militant in terms of breastfeeding. Their help may be combined with some advice from the British Thyroid Foundation, might have been just something that could help specifically with my scenario, just because when I spoke to people in the NHS who were supposed to be trained breastfeeding specialists, there wasn't really any understanding of breastfeeding with a thyroid problem or breastfeeding with tongue tie issues. There wasn't really any support that I had that addressed any of those issues. And the final thing that I think I would have done differently, and if you are struggling yourself, I also think you should consider, is to accept that, like your birth, your baby's feeding experiences may not necessarily match what you expect they're going to be. It's something you have to sort of accept on your own terms and then in your own time. However you feed your baby, it shouldn't really matter. Fed is definitely best. It isn't a reflection on the love that we have for our children, and it isn't a reflection on the quality of our parenting. I hope my story has helped somebody out there. If it has, then please consider sharing this with another mum who's struggling. Don't forget to hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.